I'd like to thank the organizers, Chris in particular, and all of you for being here. I'm very happy about and humbled by being in the presence of people working on great stuff. Mohammed's already left, but I'm looking forward to getting to his book, and I know I'm looking forward to getting to Sarah's work as well. And it's already led to some nice discussions so far, so this is great. In many ways, I think it's inter and multidisciplinarity kind of stuff seems to be what we're doing. And in my case, of course, that's guided my own thinking in many ways for a number of years, but I won't bore you with all those details at the moment. Suffice it to say, the crucial question that I've been trying to address for a number of years, and upon which my book, hopefully coming out in 2013, will deal with as well, is how connected are discussions about soul, spirit, say from theology, or basically discussions about soul and spirit across seemingly distinct disciplines, such as medicine, philosophy, theology, hadith, Quranic tafsir, etc. Did pre-modern authors leave behind their understanding of soul and spirit, say from theology, when they moved to discussions in medicine, or vice versa? Or did the conversations within one discipline or genre build upon and or modify the conversations in the other discipline or genre? And what was the true impact of such cross-genre conversations? Did they lead to an affirmation or apologia for basic doctrinal positions? Or were they more interesting and creative with influences moving in multiple directions across multiple fields? I do not hope to suggest that I can cover a broad history of these cross-genre influences across the entire pre-modern period, nor do I wish to suggest that these conversations are always necessarily cross-disciplinary and mutually reinforcing. I want to instead focus on a specific individual, Ibn Nafis, who died in 1288, and show how for him discussions of soul and spirit in medical texts were informed by and informed themselves discussions in philosophy and theology on these issues. Nonetheless, by doing so, I shall also suggest that he was working within a tradition where such cross-fertilization was the norm, even in the case where specific authors may have rejected the understanding of these terms as found in other genres. That is to say, philosophers, theologians, Quranic exegetes, hadith commentators, physicians were not ignorant of the discussions of these topics across disciplines, even if they chose to perhaps modify or reject or alter the understanding of these terms as found in other genres. We thus do a great disservice to the intellectual tapestry of pre-modern Islamic thought if we adhere to the confines of modern disciplinary boundaries. And I'd go further to say, even if we're trying to understand what Quranic exegetes are trying to do with certain Quranic terms, or even the Quran itself maybe is doing, we'd be better off looking at some of these larger discussions in these other contexts. Now, the way I'd written the paper and based on how the conversations have proceeded, I don't think the entire paper I've written is actually going to work that well. In particular, some of the discussions I had highlighted, I'll still cover much of it, but some of the other ones I don't think are going to be as interesting and perhaps as talking about specific notions of breathing in soul and spirit that show up in Ibn Tufail's Hayy ibn Yaqzan and Ibn Nafis's response to it. So if you'll indulge me, when we get to that stage, I'll do kind of extempore and I'll go ahead and do some of that. But some background at least in terms of who Ibn Nafis was and when he lived. He was a physician and Shafi'i jurist who lived during the 13th century. He was born somewhere near Damascus in 1210, moved and settled in Cairo. To give a sense of the political climate, the Mongols invaded and destroyed Baghdad in 1258, even though they started rebuilding stuff again. A few years later, they attacked Syria and Egypt, where fortuitous circumstances ensured that the Mamluk rulers of Egypt emerged victorious. Basically, the Mongol ruler had died back in Karakoram, and so half the army left. And so the Mamluks emerged victorious. The destruction wrought on the eastern lands, at least temporarily, meant that there was a significant brain drain from the east into the regions of Syria and Egypt, and a similar brain drain was taking place from the west into Syria and Egypt because of the Spanish Reconquista. Amidst this unanticipated rise of brilliant scholars, Ibn Nafis was still able to hold his own. He was very close to the patronage circle of Mamluk Sultan al-Mansur al-Qalawun, who also built the first hospital after a while in the land of Egypt. To whose newly established hospital Ibn Nafis actually bequeathed his property and books. He's also reported to have trained the next generation of physicians in Egypt and Syria, and even the chief physician under Sultan al-Qalawun was supposed to have attended Ibn Nafis's home for educational sessions. Now, The crucial part for Ibn Nafis, he was the first physician, and maybe even the only physician. I was trying to rack my brains last week at a conference with another scholar of Islamic medicine to come up with someone else that we knew who wrote a line-by-line commentary on Ibn Sina's Qanun al-Tib, or Qanun fi al-Tib, which is a massive text. And we could not come up with one who had written a line-by-line commentary on the entire text, not just the book 1 or the anatomical sections. But that's what Ibn Nafis did. And it clarified for subsequent generations of physicians and scholars how to understand and wrestle with its finer points. He also wrote this abstract of a text called the Mujaz, the Epitome, geared towards students, which was commented upon actually all the way up until the 20th century. Now, some of us may be more familiar with Ibn Nafis in the context of medicine with the pulmonary transit of blood, and that is what he's famous for, but no one's actually in the past, and this is where I'm going a little bit extempore. The pulmonary transit of blood is an anatomical result for Ibn Nafis, but a lot of it actually comes out with his physiological understanding of the body and how he modifies that in the context of debates over soul, spirit, and bodily resurrection. Right, so this is what I'm going to focus on. I'm focus more on the soul and spirit debates and what's going on, and the physiology rather than talking about the anatomical aspect. That's some of what I do in the book. So what was the physiological basis, and how can we get to seeing some of that? The recognition that we need to understand the underlying theory of Ibn Nafis that gave rise to his anatomical result actually forces us to understand the role of soul and spirit in physiology, in classical and medieval medicine, including the works of Ibn Nafis. For Ibn Nafis vehemently maintains in his discussion of the anatomy of the heart that the reason the septum wall cannot be porous is because that would result in the corruption of the spirit found in the left side, for the mixing with the thick blood of the right side would ruin the spirit's substance. So what is the spirit and what is its role in the body? The term here is ruh. That's the term Ibn Nafis uses. Such that, of course, it leads him to anatomical results subsequently. So let's begin with the definition of ruh as far as Ibn Nafis is concerned. In his discussion on the vital faculties, or the al-quwwat al-hayawaniyya, in the section of the Qanun fi al-Tib, in book 1, the Kulliyat, Ibn Sina begins a discussion of the spirit and how it is supposed to be the bearer of the faculties, or the al-hamila lil-qiba, right, is how he defines it, and is generated from the subtle elements of the bodily humors. That actually ties back to what Sarah was talking about, jism latif. That's where it comes from, right, that it's a subtle body that is actually generated from the humors of the body. When Ibn Nafis comes to comment on this section, he says there are actually two understandings of spirit that are common at his day. He goes, the first is found in Kutub al-Ilahiyya, right, so the divine books, such as the Quran. He actually names one. And he goes, wherein the term ruh is used to signify something similar to what the Falasifa call nafs in their books. So this is going to tie back in, of course, and Ibn Nafis recognizes that the terms are not identical. In the Quran, that the ruh and nafs are used differently, but he's using the standard definition that ruh means what Falasifa mean by nafs when they're talking about it in their philosophical books. He goes, the second meaning of ruh is found in the works of the Falasifa and the physicians themselves, by which they mean a jism latif, a subtle, fine body, and actually a jism bukhariya, a vaporous body, right, which is generated from the finer parts of the blood and the remaining humors. In the second case, the spirits are seen as the bearers of the faculties. The faculties are known as the forms, and they come from the soul. They're emanated by the soul, which need a physical matter to carry and distribute them to the body. Now clearly there's a lot here that needs to be unpacked. I've used three terms: qiwa, faculties, nafs, soul, and ruh. Ruh we're starting to get some sense of in the medical usage, but let me go ahead and get into how discussions in natural science, or basically al-ilm al-tabi'iyya, or al-tabi'i, and then metaphysics, theology, and medicine, how they're using these terms interchangeably and how these things are working. So let's begin with the understanding of the concept of soul, according to philosophers and those who work in medicine and natural science. For this, we need to go back to Aristotle. Not because I'm suggesting that medieval Islamic authors never went beyond Aristotle. That's actually not true at all. They went significantly far from Aristotle. But the larger enterprise of how to investigate nature and what is it that we do when we investigate nature was derived, or outlined at least, by Aristotle, and it was in his footsteps that they followed, including people like Galen, who disagreed also with Aristotle, as did Ibn Sina, as did Ibn Nafis. So they could disagree about specific issues, but the larger conceptualization of what brings these natural sciences together was very much coming out of Aristotle. Here's a well-known passage from Aristotle's Parts of Animals, where he really describes what he means by soul. He says, a dead body, and this is something I mentioned in the context of Muhammad's talk, has exactly the same configuration as a living one, but for all that is not a man. For like a physician in a painting, or like a flute in a sculpture, in spite of its name, it will be unable to perform its function. If now this something that constitutes the form of the living being be the soul, or part of the soul, or something that without the soul cannot exist, as would seem to be the case, seeing at any rate that when the soul departs, what is left is no longer a living animal, and that none of the parts remain what they were before, excepting in a mere configuration like the animals in the fable that are turned into stone. If I say this be so, then it will come within the province of the investigator of nature to inform himself concerning the soul and to treat of it either in its entirety or at any rate of that part of it which constitutes the essential character. And inasmuch as it is the presence of the soul that enables matter to constitute the animal nature, the inquirer into nature is bound on every ground to treat of the soul. Right? So the soul is fundamentally, for Aristotle, that which allows a body to partake in the actions of life. As Aristotle says in another place, in the De Anima on the soul, that which has soul is distinguished from that which has not by living. The fact that something is living means that it has a soul, right, versus a dead thing. And he goes, and insofar as the investigator of natural nature studies living things, the soul is part of an investigation of nature. This is not theology, this is just a standard interpretation of nature, or investigation of nature. Aristotle, of course, identifies actions that one usually associates with life with the soul. So he says nutrition, growth, movement, sensation, etc. Right? His claim then is that these actions do not arise in the body by virtue of its matter, but rather due to the soul associated with the matter. The body doesn't feed itself because it's matter. It feeds itself because the soul gives it the power to feed itself. Right? That's kind of what's going on. Ibn Sina, the great Islamic philosopher and physician, explains this neatly in the following passage from his book on the soul, where he says, nourishment, growth, and reproduction do not arise in these bodies by virtue of their physicality. Rather, they have in their essences principles other than physicality that are responsible for these actions. And whatever gives rise to such actions cannot be devoid of will and is therefore called soul. Now notice nourishment, growth, and reproduction. These are the absolute basic as basic things can get. This is not specific to humans or animals. This is plants as well. And yes, as far as this investigation was concerned, plants have souls. Right? It's a nafs. Yep. Sorry, I do want to emphasize. Throughout my talk, when I say soul, I mean nafs. And when I say spirit, I mean ruh. Right? So I'm using those are the terms that I'm using interchangeably because I'm following the philosophers in their understanding. Now, of course, Aristotle did not want to say that the body is always engaged in every one of these actions because, of course, sometimes you're not moving, right, in terms of physically locomotion. You may not be necessarily using a sense in a particular time, right? Maybe you don't have the sense to touch for the time being, or let's say, whatever it is. So he goes, what distinguishes a living body from a dead body is that the former, by virtue of being connected or having this soul, has the capacity or a potential to perform the action, not that it's necessarily engaging in the action. You don't want a definition that's so restrictive that says, I only have a soul when I'm actually moving about and doing something. You know, the idea is if I'm asleep, I also have a soul at some point, right? Because I have the potential to do it, versus death is something very clearly different. I don't have the capacity anymore. And that is what they mean by quwwa, or faculty, or power. And of course, in the Aristotelian concept, also known as potentiality, right? That I have the capacity or the potential to do an action. And that's what quwwa is. Thus, what is meant by a plant having a soul that has a quwwa for nutrition and growth is that the plant is capable of growth and nutrition. But of course, it doesn't have the faculty of movement according to them. So the plant cannot move, right? That is part of its definition. Animal, on the other hand, has a soul that has a faculty of nutrition, growth, but also locomotion and sensation and even imagination, which implies that it is capable of all of these things, to sense, to move, to imagine, whereas, of course, a plant cannot do the latter things, it can only do nourishment. So the tie between soul, faculty, and the actual action can be described thus. The soul is what technically gives the body the faculty or the capacity to perform these actions in some way, right? And it gives this body these powers by somehow bestowing it upon the material body. The soul itself, as far as Aristotle is concerned, is not a material body itself, right? It is an immaterial body. And so we come to the final piece of the puzzle for Aristotle. The soul is immaterial, the body is material, and somehow these faculties or these capacities are being communicated to the body. What is the thing that is communicating them, right? Does the soul just give the body these things by virtue of its association? And Aristotle here basically comes up with this notion of spirit, and he locates it in the heart. And he says that the heart is what governs the actions of the body. So for Aristotle, the heart is the central organ. It is the one that's responsible for nutrition, it's the one that's responsible for cognition, it's the one that's responsible for sensation and everything. Now, we can be a little charitable to Aristotle. Nerves, arteries, and veins were not distinguished at the time of Aristotle, right? So we can be a little charitable in terms of how we go about reading him. And of course, he saw it in the chicken embryo. The first thing, and he does this experiment in the history of animals. He goes, you get chicken eggs or bird eggs, and each day you kind of pop it open and you see what's going on in it, right? Or you pop a hole in it and you kind of see through it. And in the context of the egg, slowly you see a pulsating red dot. And he goes, see, the heart is the first thing that comes into existence, right, with the pulsating red blood. And so that's where he picked it up too. Now, if the heart receives, it's the first thing that shows signs of life. That's the way it was seen, right? So that means the soul has given life to this dead matter in the heart. And if the heart is governing these actions, how does it govern them? How does it tell my hand to sense? How does it tell my hand to nourish itself, or any of those kinds of things? That is what was assigned to the spirit. In Aristotle, the term is pneuma in the Greek. And when it's translated into Arabic, it becomes ruh. Right, and it's a good job by the translators, because the pneuma also carries these notions of breath and air and wind. Sorry, I shouldn't say breath, but air and wind in the Greek, and they pick up in the Arabic a term that matches it much better, actually, than another one would. And for Aristotle, the spirit is a material body. There's no doubt about it, and it's what he calls the first instrument of the soul. It's what the soul uses as a physical thing to push and pull the limbs, right, to perform the actions. And the spirit comes out from the heart. So it's found in the heart and then kind of branches out and it kind of takes all these powers or these faculties, these qiwa, out to the rest of the body parts. And it does this through the various vessels that emanate out of the heart. When we get to Galen, by Galen's time, the arteries, veins, and nerves have actually been accurately described, and they've been isolated, and there's a recognition that these are very, very different things. Such that Aristotle, he cannot follow Aristotle into saying that the nerves originate in the heart. He's like, I have a very hard time seeing that that's the source of the nerves, which then starts to throw lots of things off anatomically and physiologically. Galen also took great pains to show that the brain was the organ that governed the actions of sensation and movement, and it was the nerves through which that took place. But he was still committed to Aristotle's understanding that it was the soul that ultimately differentiated life from death. There's something about what is it that gives life to dead matter, and he said that's the soul, right? And it does give the powers in some way. The body's ability to partake in these actions of life was due to its soul. He was also committed to Aristotle's notion that the soul could only bestow its faculties to one organ. Now this goes into a specific philosophical understanding of from the one only emanates the one. The simple thing can only communicate to one other simple thing. And there's a larger kind of tradition that I don't necessarily go into. I'm not really sure I'm the best person to go into and give details about as well. Galen picks up on that, but he recognizes that there are three different organ systems that are important. So he actually says that there are three souls, or three parts of the soul. And that's in a nutshell the diagram that we'll go through shortly, just to talk about how that worked. So Galen thought of the body as having three interrelated yet distinct physiological systems. The first was associated with nourishment and growth. Blood in the humors played a major role in nutrition, and Galen saw the liver as generating these bodily humors, right? I mean, the food is absorbed, it comes into the stomach, goes to the liver, and he saw that that's where the blood and everything else is created. So he goes, the liver clearly is in charge of nutrition in some way. And so what he said was that the liver is associated with the soul. It's called the desiderative soul, right? Which gives to the body the faculty to nourish and grow, right? And so the liver is in charge of nourishment and growth in that it bestows, it communicates through the veins this faculty to nourish and growth to the rest of the members, right? And it also sends out the stuff from which it nourishes and grows, i.e. the humors and the blood. All right, the heart, which I want to emphasize, what is crucial in the heart is the left side of the heart, right? The right side of the heart is still associated with blood and kind of the way the liver is functioning, and it has veins going through it. But the left side of the heart was really the seat of another set of faculties as far as Galen was concerned. He said it was what generated the ruh, or the spirit, and replenished the innate heat necessary for all bodily actions, right? And that's what the left side of the heart did. Its actions were seen as vital for life, from which we get the term quwwat al-hayat, or al-quwwat al-hayawaniya in terms of the animal faculties, which are also often translated as vital faculties because the Latin translation went into vital. It was seen as, for Galen, it was a seat of the passionate soul. So there was this another part of the soul, or another soul, that gave the passions to the heart and these vital faculties, which were necessary for the creation of the spirit to balance the innate heat. And also the heart provided this boiling of the blood for the human being to act irrationally, right, or passionately. And that's how Galen tried to say was the role. He also said that the arteries pulse because of this vital faculty. They don't pulse because the heart pushes blood in or something. They pulse because they have a faculty in them. And that's communicated through the arteries to the rest of the body. The brain was the seat of the sensitive soul, right? It was responsible for the actions of movement and sensation, and it governed these actions through the nerves, in which it sent something called the psychic spirit, right? The psychic spirit itself was derived from the spirit of the heart, but also could, for Galen, it could also come directly from the nostrils, right? You could just breathe air and that would be just cooked up in the brain and produce this psychic spirit. Now, by the time Galen arrives in the Islamic lands, there's some systematization that's taken place, and they've kind of codified things in a neat way, which is what explains this diagram better, right? And they've kind of tried to piece out and fix some of the issues that they found in Galen to meet the requirements of Aristotelian philosophy. In this case, then, the soul can only emanate its faculties to the spirit within a particular chief organ. So suddenly now we have something called a natural spirit with the liver. So that's what receives the natural faculties, and it's communicated through the veins, and it brings these faculties of nourishment and growth to the rest of the body, and so now the body can nourish itself. It has the capacity to absorb nutrition and grow. The vital faculties are emanated to the vital spirit by the soul associated there. And it carries them, the spirit over there carries these faculties to the rest of them. And then the psychic faculties, of course, always had a role with the spirit as far as Galen was concerned as well. All right. The important next step then, this was basically the reigning medical understanding in about 8th, 9th century Islamic world, actually dates back to earlier than that too. The fact that the spirit is generated from inhaled air that is cooked up in some way in the lungs and goes through, and that it's warm and that it brings life to it, may help us understand some of the kind of context in the Quran in terms of the life-giving element of the ruh, right? And particularly the glosses and the exegetes give to it in terms of the breath and why that's important for life, right? These were the reigning medical theories of the time, which are being used by the people to understand what's going on. And there's a fascinatingly close tie between soul and spirit, right? That the soul emanates the powers to the spirit, even if they're two distinct things. But they're starting to get very close to one another. The important next step for a journey to understand Ibn Nafis's modifications of understanding of soul, spirit, faculty, body is Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina probably needs little introduction, phenomenal philosopher, phenomenal physician from Eastern Iran during the end of the 10th, beginning 11th century. In terms of his brilliance and impact on philosophy, science, and medicine, he would be on par with Aristotle and Galen, and probably even higher, right? In my opinion, actually, he would be greater than both of them. Wrote a lot, but most importantly, presented also a unified system of thought that brought together all the natural sciences, metaphysics and theology and medicine in a way that had even eluded Aristotle, right? I mean, to really talk about them as a systemic, in terms of a larger system. And what's fascinating about Ibn Sina is that much of that system really comes together very briefly and quickly in his Isharat wa Tanbihat, right? His admonitions or indications and admonitions or rejoinders, where he really shows how all these sciences are lumped up together, even more so than his Kitab al-Shifa, the Book of Healing, which still treats of them like Aristotle in separate branches. One of the hallmarks of Ibn Sina's mammoth canon of medicine, the Qanun fi Tibb, was to place medicine on a firm philosophical and scientific basis. As such, when he saw Galen's theory of three souls, or three parts of a soul, he says, that's nonsense. Our notions of soul tell us that we can't be different, right? So he gives a lot of these metaphysical, philosophical proofs about how the soul has to be simple, right? How there is such a thing as the soul, which is our identity, because if it wasn't, then our entire body, which keeps changing throughout life, right? What is it? The kind of experiment that Jawad, you were mentioning earlier, right? I mean, we can think about replacing any part of our body, but we'd still have this sense of ourself. And Ibn Sina goes through multiple proofs to show exactly that, right? That there must be something else that gives us our sense of self. And what is that? And he goes, that's the nafs. He says that it also has to be simple. It cannot be compound, right? And one of the main proofs within those contexts also comes to this idea that it's the nafs that develops intellection. Now that we have a concept of universals only because the nafs is simple and immaterial, and that's why we can have a notion of universals. Otherwise, it will always be this chair or this table. You won't have a universal concept of chair or table. So Ibn Sina gets to this and he goes, Galen's three chief physiological system is based on a premise of compound soul, or three souls, and that cannot be right. So he rejects it and he seeks to improve on it and figures out how is it that we can move further. And how is it that we can understand the relationship of the soul with the body? All right. Given that it's only one soul, Ibn Sina argued, much like Aristotle had and others, that it can only emanate its faculties to one organ. Right? And for Ibn Sina, that again ended up being heart. Now the problem is, he was aware of Galen's more anatomically advanced physiology. And he was very certain that yes, the brain does indeed govern the actions of motion. So what does it mean to say that the faculties are emanated to the heart, or to the spirit inside the heart? And this is what leads Ibn Sina to really modify his understanding of what's going on in the physiology. So what is the introduction? What is the stuff that he introduces? Let's see, where am I? He introduces the notion that even though the psychic and natural faculties, so the faculty to sense and the faculty to grow, are present in the spirit of the heart when it first receives it, they're not really ready to be used by the body until the spirit arrives in the liver, or the spirit arrives in the brain. Moreover, he also argued that when the heart receives these faculties and it gets the spirit, it gets this thing called the vital faculty. But he changes the definition of vital faculty. He says the vital faculty is no longer passionate boiling or kind of pulsation. He has that. He says, yes, it's important for those reasons. And of course, it's creating the spirit and it's kind of tempering the innate heat. But he goes further. And he says, it's when this arrives, this vital spirit with the vital faculty arrives in the rest of the body, that it prepares the body to receive the psychic faculties. The example that he gives is that of paralysis. Right? He says a paralyzed limb does not have psychic faculties. Right? He says its connection with the brain is moot. But he goes, it can still, but it hasn't disintegrated. It's still alive in some way. And this is where he plays with this notion of al-quwwat al-hayat or al-quwwat al-hayawaniyya, which one is it, right? And he says it's the vital spirit that makes it living. It brings life to this organ so that it can now partake. But it's fascinating. He doesn't say it brings life to the organ so it can nourish. The idea could be, well, it can probably just nourish itself. Why do we need another faculty? He goes, no, it's when the spirit arrives that it gives this capacity to nourish itself. Subsequently, that organ can now nourish itself. So it's not just pure nourishment that gives rise to or prepares something to partake in sensation and motion. That you need this third faculty. Now, it would be unfair to characterize Ibn Sina as purely Aristotelianizing Galen, because by doing so, he's introduced this notion of vital faculty that is alien to Aristotle. Aristotle has no vital faculty. It makes no sense in the context of Aristotle, that you need a separate thing to prepare something when the heart is the source of all those things. But by doing so, he provides his own unique physiology, a fact that was actually not lost on Ibn Nafis or subsequent authors. They recognized that Ibn Sina had done something very different than what is found in either Aristotle or earlier. And it was Ibn Sina's understanding of the vital faculty as the preparatory faculty for the psychic faculties and the nutritive faculties that will subsequently influence Islamic as well as Latin Western medicine. But I'm not really going to go into... It's Ibn Sina's new definition of the vital faculty as preparing the rest of the organs to participate in natural faculties and psychic faculties that will then impact subsequent Islamic and Latin Western medicine, and not the original Aristotelian or the original Galenic understanding of what it is, right? But I digress. That's not the point of this particular aspect. Final point about Ibn Sina, and then after that I'll really go extempore because I'm not going to actually use the stuff that I have over here, is how Ibn Sina came to understand the soul's particular relationship with the body, right? Often we forget, I mean, because he gets slammed by Ghazali in Tahafut al-Falasifa, and of course lots of other philosophers and theologians got very upset with Ibn Sina and said, oh, he denies resurrection, or those kinds of things. It's not entirely true. Ibn Sina is very, very committed very committed to individual resurrection, because for him there can be no ethics if there is no afterlife. He's very clear about that. There is no ethical framework if there is no afterlife. And for an afterlife, it means individual resurrection. It can't be some kind of universal resurrection of the species or something like that. He's also very opposed to Razi's notion of metempsychosis, which actually solves one of the problems, as we'll see, for Ibn Sina, but he rejects it. The idea that a soul can migrate at death from one body to another body and then kind of continue on in that way. Ibn Sina's like, no, that would not make the person ethically responsible for their actions in that one lifetime and stuff, right? I mean, so he has some severe problems with those issues. And in fact, Ibn Sina went further than any other Muslim theologian and philosopher to actually provide proofs for the existence of God and the necessity of prophecy, right? He felt these were essentials, right, and necessary for the functioning of the world. Now, it's true that he felt that the prophets were not necessary for smart people like him, but they were necessary for the larger population and to lay down. And I will say this much: even for Ibn Sina and smart people like him, the law was still something that was given by the prophet, and they could not arrive at it entirely on their own. They could only do a post hoc rationalization of the law. So, Ibn Sina is very much committed to and believed in the reality of the Quranic emphasis on the survival of something after death, right? Or some notion of an afterlife, even if it's not survival of something after death, that there's such a thing that will be held accountable for. So he developed a fuller understanding of what it is that the soul is as a substance in its own right. So we've seen a lot about in the medical context. Galen, of course, doesn't even say, it's like what the actual soul is. He goes, it doesn't really concern me. I'm really interested in what it does for medicine, right? Aristotle, of course, has some very vague passages about what the soul is trying to do in his book on the soul and trying to have an investigation, but it's not satisfactory. And Ibn Sina is aware of it, that it's not satisfactory. And so he tries to develop a much fuller exposition of what it is that the nafs really is in itself. And he develops this notion that it's immaterial, that it is a substance, and that it is a simple substance. And by virtue of being immaterial, it cannot degenerate or decompose, right? I mean, so it's immaterial. He's very clear that the soul comes into existence at the time with the body. Right? There is no prior existence of the soul before the existence of the body. So there too, he's actually, in many ways, I mean, he's staying true to Aristotle, but he's also very interestingly staying true to some notions that he can pick up from the Quran. That the Quran seems to talk about whole entities and individuals together, right, in its use of nafs at the very least. And so Ibn Sina's notion that the soul only exists with the body, there's a lot going for it. But what happens after death? And that was the million-dollar question for Ibn Sina, as to how is it that when someone dies, can the soul survive? Now, I won't go into the details, but Robert Wisnowski has brilliant work on Avicenna's Metaphysics in Context, where he shows how Ibn Sina, through some of the philosophical stuff that was taking place, could come to the conclusion that the soul survives after death, because he had started to reject the notion that the soul was just the form of the body. Right? So if it's a form of the matter, then of course once the matter degenerates, so does the form. So the soul would have to degenerate. He wants a survival. So he changes the definition. The soul is not the form of the body, it's the perfection of the body. And as perfection, it can be external to the body in some way. Question remains, once my soul is no longer associated with my body, what makes it my soul? Right? Because it's an immaterial thing. We can talk about chairs, but the only way we can distinguish one chair from another chair is when we see it in the actual matter. Right? How can we have different souls when they're immaterial? Their only way to individuate them is in matter. Right? And that was an issue that Ibn Sina kind of tried to play with, but did not have a satisfactory answer. And it's what Ghazali latches onto to slam him, as did subsequent other authors, as to what is it, Ibn Sina, that would individuate it. Ibn Sina plays with this idea that the memories will somehow individuate it. But of course, the problem that Ibn Sina faces there is memory is associated and localized in the brain. It's an actual material process for Ibn Sina. So that can't work, because the body is degenerated. What is it that's individuating? So, you know, he does some wish-washy answers about knowledge that's been acquired and things like that, but they're not satisfactory. In the context of Ibn Nafis, he's basically going to come and pick up on this issue, because he's writing in the context of post-Ghazali slamming of Ibn Sina, that this solution to resurrection is not satisfactory. He's also writing in the aftermath of Ibn Tufail and his Hayy ibn Yaqzan, where Ibn Tufail tries to also play with these ideas and say, how is it that the soul can survive after death? And Ibn Tufail is very interesting, because he's also at the same time trying to establish this notion that we can have access to the divine mind through mushahada, right, or this kind of spiritual insight. And so he does some very fascinating things, which in the discussion I can go into detail about, in terms of spirit and soul. And he comes back and redefines the soul as actually the form of the spirit, literally the spirit here, not the body, but the spirit. And then he says that the spirit actually survives death, so that it literally departs. It doesn't disintegrate, it departs. And the spirit is not actually made up of air so much as it is made up of this divine element. And he kind of plays with this notion of God emanates the spirit, and he's, you know, the Quranic verse can be in the background even though he doesn't actually cite it, and all kinds of fascinating things that he's doing with there. Now Ibn Nafis, I can say quite definitively, is very anti-mushahada and very anti-Sufi in those ways. So he really rejects that interpretation. But he also wants to show that there's some way that one can understand and defend bodily resurrection on a scientific footing, right? He also has a new understanding of reason and revelation. He actually doesn't feel, Ibn Sina was very adamant, and he said, look, revelation speaks to the masses as much as prophecy is necessary. It still uses an idiom of the masses. And what we do in philosophy is we come up with demonstrative proofs and rational inquiry, and you cannot use the language of the masses to establish something definitively. So he says the Quranic verse, yes, you're telling me bodily resurrection, but it holds no water for me because I can't use that for my own notions. I need to develop it philosophically. Ibn Nafis, writing in the aftermath where some of these debates are taking place and people have realized we can't have demonstrative proofs for necessarily everything, or at least we may be far away from getting them, is playing with this idea that you can have revelation actually help reason out in some ways. So that's some of the larger project that he's dealing with in a theological text, which is different from his medical text. In the medical text, he's playing with these ideas about there's a lot going on. Ibn Sina has said that the soul emanates to the spirit, these faculties, but it prepares the rest of the body to receive these faculties. And he says, but the faculty was never an actual thing to begin with. It was the capacity to perform the action. So what Ibn Sina has done, and he said that the vital faculty is the capacity to have the capacity to perform the action. Right? It's a two-level capacity or potential. And he goes, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, how can you have the potential to do something? Right? You just have the potential to do something. So he's figuring some of these elements out, and he goes, these are unsatisfactory. So he comes back and redefines these terms. He goes, let me go back to the root of them and try to figure out how can I re-understand them. Spirit, he keeps exactly the way it had been passed on. Vaporous body, subtle body, and all kinds of things that goes in, and it's the one that carries the faculties. He's very clear about it. But he makes a slight change. He goes, not that which carries the faculties, that which really carries the psychic faculties, or some of those things, or faculties associated with animals, not those associated with plants, because he says the plants don't have spirit. They have souls, they don't have spirit, right? So they have no ruh. He says, and the plants, they have a soul, and the soul emanates the capacity to nourish to the entire plant. There's no central organ from which these things are being distributed out, right? There's no spirit. He goes, that's the same with the human body or any other animal body. The soul is not tied to one organ. It's actually connected to the entire body. He says, because any organ, the heart, for example, is actually not temperamentally balanced. He goes, the heart is very hot. Other parts of the body are cool and moist. Some are dry, some are this. He goes, it's only the entire body as a whole that you can talk about having some kind of temperamental balance, at least in its healthy state, right? And he goes, that's what the soul is connected to. It's not connected to something that is hot. It's connected to something that is temperamentally balanced or in equilibrium, right? I'm blanking out right now on the actual Arabic. I think it's Mu'tadil, if I'm not mistaken, but that's what he uses. And so, given that the soul is associated with the entire body, he says, well, every part of the body is capable of nourishment and growth by virtue of the fact that the soul just gives it that power. By the fact that it's associated with the soul, it has the capacity to nourish itself and to grow. He goes, then we come to the issue of movement. He goes, for that we need something else called the spirit. It's the spirit that is necessary for movement and for sensation. It's what's communicated by the brain and the nerves and all those kinds of things. But he goes, the spirit is actually hot. It's not balanced in any shape or form. It's hot. It's very hot. And he says it's actually heat is necessary because that's what allows for its quick movement, right? And so he says the soul gives the spirit the capacity to move when it is in the heart because it's extremely hot. And then when it arrives in the brain and kind of cools down a bit, the soul gives it the capacity to now participate in actions of sensation and cognition and all of those kinds of things, which require a cooler spirit, right? So just by switching things up and saying that the soul is communicated to the entire body, he's now redefined the soul-spirit connection too. And what ends up happening, and this has something to do with Ibn Nafis, Ibn Tufail, and to some extent Ibn Sina too, is that he really dissociates the soul from the spirit. Right? The spirit is no way just the first instrument of the soul, because that's the entire body. I mean, we can nourish ourselves just that way. Right? We don't need the spirit to do so. Whereas for all of these other people, the spirit and its location in the heart had some kind of central role to play in everything related to the soul. It was the first instrument. And for Ibn Nafis, that's the way for him to attack the Sufis and kind of remove that kind of notion of mushahada and everything that Ibn Tufayl builds his entire system on. More than that, the next part then becomes, well, when is the soul, coming back to an earlier notion with Muhammad, right? When is it that the soul attaches itself to the body, and how is this related to resurrection? And let me first talk about how this physiology gives rise to his new theory of embryogenesis, and then how the embryogenesis is actually directly his proof for resurrection of the body. So, the embryogenesis. One of the crucial issues, especially if you have spirit as the bearer, or the spirit that is somehow the first instrument of the soul, problem arises immediately with embryogenesis, because the male semen is seen as having spirit, the female is not, and the male semen leaves the male body and makes its way into the female body. And if it's the first instrument of the soul, what's going on, right? And how is the soul arising then when the two semens mix? Is the male spirit the one that is carrying this faculty? And in fact, what Avicenna had maintained was, he said that the male semen has the al-quwwat al-aqida, right? And the female semen had al-quwwat al-munaqida, I think is what the term is, or coming out of the inaqida word, right? So, and the phrase that he uses is of cheese and whey, right? Or kind of, the active ingredient to ferment the cheese versus the one that has the capacity to be fermented, right? So both of them have faculties, but one has an active faculty and one's a passive faculty to be formed, and the other one is to form, right, or inform. But Ibn Nafis says, but I thought the faculties come from the soul. He goes, the mother's capacity I can understand. Okay, somehow the mother's soul is still giving this faculty to the female womb. But he goes, how is this sperm that is no longer part of the man still associated with that man's soul? How can it be carrying it? And how can it have this faculty? And he says there is no such thing. Neither of them have any faculty, because they have no power. They cannot nourish themselves. Because all that happens is that when the two mix, they receive a temperament of equilibrium balanced, right? One's heat quenches the other one, and they kind of arrive at a temporally balanced formation. And that allows for the faydan al-nafs, right, from khaliqiha, right? So the God emanates the soul to that temperamentally balanced mixture, which is literally just the mixture of two semen, right, male and female. And once that happens, lo and behold, his physiology takes over. The soul emanates the natural faculties to this mixture because it doesn't need the spirit. So now they can grow and nourish themselves. The spirit that exists in it can receive from this soul now the faculty of movement. And as the embryo grows, more spirit can be generated from the first spirit and all those kinds of things, and then the thing pans out, right? And so that's his embryogenesis. That's what ends up happening in generation, and he's modified Ibn Sina's understanding of how that works, and he's rejected Ibn Sina's physiological understanding. Direct tie to resurrection? Well, when he does it in two ways. He has this text called Fadl ibn Natiq, which is a response to Ibn Tufayl's Hayy ibn Yaqzan. And in Ibn Tufayl's context, Ibn Tufayl had said that there's a spontaneous generation of a human being on a deserted island, which is absolutely in equilibrium, is what Ibn Tufayl talks about. And he talks about how God emanates the spirit, and it conjoins with it, and kind of has this very mystical notion going on in that passage. Ibn Nafis, on the other hand, says no. He goes, the contents of the cave in which this body is generated, are such that they, can form the temperaments of each individual organ in their own way, right? So one of them is maybe cold and dry, so it can take the temperament of X, and something is hot and warm, and they kind of come together. And then the air that is in the cave is suitable that it gets kind of cooked up to make the spirit. The spirit has no divine element. It's just something that's a subtle body that comes out of the vapors of these contents of the cave and mixes with the air and is good enough to kind of resemble the spirit. And he goes, and the God at that point, because this entire contents of the cave are in balance, God emanates the soul to this, and a new creature comes into being. Versus Ibn Tufayl, in Ibn Tufayl's case, God emanates the soul to the spirit in the heart directly, right? So those are, again, the two, they show the differences in physiology. Now, when we get to death and resurrection, he says, in a passage towards the end of the text, how to defend bodily resurrection. Well, he goes through the classic Ibn Sina's proofs for the soul is immaterial, the soul is simple, and all of those. He goes, but now the problem is what individuates it after death. And he goes, it's individuated by the mixed matter of which is temperamentally balanced, to which the soul was first attached when the human being came into being, i.e. that's original mixture of the two semen. Interestingly, he calls that mixture in his Fadl ibn Natiq. He doesn't say that in the Qanun fi Tib, or his commentary on the Qanun fi Tib, but in the Fadl ibn Natiq text, he calls it the Ajb al-Zanab. That's what he calls it. He says, he defines it as mixture of semen that is temperamentally balanced, to which the soul is emanated, which is called the Ajb al-Zanab. In his commentary on the Qanun fi Tib, he doesn't add that subsequent phrase. He just says, the soul is emanated to the temporally mixed matter, etc. And then he goes, the body disintegrates except the Ajb al-Zanab. Right? This original mixture never disintegrates. And then he goes at the time of, and so he goes, and the attachment of the soul to that, basically what the soul does at death is it stops emanating the faculties. So the body stops growing. That's what it means by dying. Right? He goes, that continues on. You have it in the grave, and then he does something about how the punishment of the grave can that way take place because the soul is still attached to that. Philosophically, it doesn't actually make sense how sensation and stuff would work in that context, but we'll let that fly for a bit. But when you get to resurrection, he goes, what happens at resurrection? He goes, that same nucleus of matter, this mixed temperamentally balanced matter that never decomposes in the grave, and to which the soul is originally attached, starts feeding again, because God commands it to. This is time for resurrection, start feeding again. And he goes, that attracts nourishment again, and it grows into, a new body. He goes, the new body is the same as the old body in the sense that it's made from the same nucleus. But it's different because in the hereafter, you have a different set of material that is being absorbed for nutrition. Right? So he goes, that's your defense of bodily resurrection in terms of how it would proceed. And he's using the physiology that he has in it. What has he done in terms of Ajb al-Zanab? You might be curious as to where that comes from. Imam Malik's Muwatta. There's a hadith that says everything of this. Well, I can probably cite the actual hadith. This I do have. The earth eats all of the son of Adam except the Ajb al-Zanab. He was created from it, and on it he is built. Right. Now, this is just one of many hadiths that everyone knows surrounding soul and various other kinds of things that exist. Right? Ibn Nafis picks this one, because this is the only one he feels he can rationalize. Right? So Ibn Qayyim, particularly in Kitab al-Ruh, who's a little after Ibn Nafis, has all of these hadith that talk about the spirit that goes, is seeing the ruh that sees the body from afar, right? And the ruh coming and going back and forth and stuff. No, that's not what Ibn Nafis picks up. He picks up this verse, this hadith, and says, that's it, the Ajb al-Zanab. And he says, he picks it up from there. He was created from it. Yeah, the temperamentally balanced mixed matter of the semen. Everyone would agree that humans are built from the two semens mixed together. That's their foundation of being built, right? And so that's what he picks up, and he says, this is it, and that's how it proceeds. That's Ibn Nafis's solution. Does it have a history subsequently? I'm not sure because I haven't followed up. It's some of the project that I'm involved in right now, particularly his theories of generation and his new understanding of physiology and what happens to it. Also interested in, of course, the pulmonary transit of blood is related to some of this stuff, which I didn't touch upon for today. But it's certainly not the one that at least Ibn Qayyim picks up. Ibn Qayyim actually very clearly states in the Kitab al-Ruh that this Ajb al-Zanab hadith, I think he calls it gharib or something, but he clearly rejects it. He says, and in fact, I think he calls it that it's kind of a Jewish influence that's come in. Because I think in either in the Mishnah Torah or somewhere, there is some reference to something similar, right? And he says that this is a foreign kind of thing that's made its way into it. But I'll just end it really there, and we can have whatever questions and discussion surrounding it.